Starlight, star bright, first star I see tonight. I wish I might have the wish I make tonight.
Sometimes the stars are in alignment when it comes to a project or an artistic endeavor. And that's definitely true of Pinocchio.
Pinocchio was not only the apex of the art form, but also that time, that perfect moment when all the people, all the artists, all the musicians were together with a great artistic leader. And that only happens once in a lifetime.
Pinocchio is a unique film because it followed Snow White, and you can see the confidence that the crew had after a huge hit like Snow White. They just rolled up their sleeves and said, let's just see what we can do with the next one.
I think there are lots of reasons why so many people list it as their favorite film. Partly, it is the whole richness of the look of the film. It is just one of the most beautiful films that have ever been made, quite simply.
As ravishing as it is, I think its most glorious achievement is the risk they're taking with story, with theme, and even with character.
Basically, Pinocchio is the ultimate expression of what is possible in the craft of the animated film.
In the history of Disney animation, Pinocchio is a very, very, very important film. It was their second feature. It was the one just after Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And that was a huge, rousing success.
People forget that Snow White was the Titanic of its day. It was a mega blockbuster.
The first feature-length animated film that anyone had ever seen on screen. So what could Disney do better than that?
Bambi, of course, was the one that had the #2 number on it, but Walt wasn't sure of it yet. He didn't know how to make the picture. So I said, well, Pinocchio is one we know how to do.
Pinocchio just seemed to have a really interesting story that offered so many possibilities for things that hadn't been done before in animation.
The original story was written by a journalist and writer who lived in Florence, in Italy. His name was Carlo Lorenzini. He was better known as Carlo Collodi. It began as a serial, rather like Dickens' stories were told, serialized week by week in what was the first journal for children published in Italy. It's a book about mischief, moral and improving stories about what you need to do if you're going to be a really good boy or a really good girl.
I think what remains durable about Pinocchio, certainly the most accessible, is this wild sense of invention and grotesque sense of adventure that Collodi has. But it comes mixed with some of the most cruel and vicious sort of moralizing centered around what it takes for this puppet to earn his right to becoming a real boy.
The moment that the work started on the film, it proved problematical.
We were pretty cocky coming off of Snow White. We thought we could just sit down and do another feature. We start working on sequences that were in the middle of the picture. Walt looked at it and he says, it's not working right.
What has to be remembered is that the character created by Carlo Collodi is essentially a bad boy.
He was brash, he was cocky, he was kind of unlikable. He was a troublemaker. Walt didn't like that as he was shaping up, so he changed him.
Disney began to realize that this little wooden character was really not very sympathetic, partly because he was drawn in the way that he was drawn.
They had started out doing some animation based on model sheets that really showed a Pinocchio that looked like a puppet, like really something that you would carve out of wood, very geometric shapes, very wooden looking. And Walt just didn't care for it. And he said, it just doesn't look alive, and I don't see the appeal.
He was so concerned about it that he actually halted production. Production stopped, and they had to decide what to do, how to take the matter forward.
They were thinking in terms of a puppet all the time, naturally, because he was a puppet. And I was very critical of what they had. So I did a little test scene where Pinocchio had the donkey ears and a tail, and he was down on the sea bottom. And he knocked on the shell of this clam and asked him if he had any idea where he could find Monsieur the whale. And I handled it, not thinking of so much as a puppet as just a little boy. Walt liked it, so that became the model, and it still refined a little bit more later, but the idea.
This is a matter of not just changing the character's design, but changing the character's behavior so that his status as a puppet was minimized.
Pinocchio changed internally by not being cocky or arrogant or being a wise guy. He actually became a really sweet, innocent little boy.
A real boy!
It was around that same time that they decided to use the cricket. The talking cricket in the book shows up once. Pinocchio kills it by throwing a hammer at it because he's annoyed because it's giving him advice. And then it shows up again as a ghost later on.
What Disney saw in this character, and goodness knows this is a testimony to Disney's sheer inventiveness, was that it could contain the kernel of something that might make this story work.
Walt had felt that there was not enough warmth. There's not enough friendship. There's no love in the story, really. So that's where he used Jiminy Cricket.
He ended up being the heart of the story instead of getting squashed with a mallet like he did in the original Collodi version.
This moralizing little character was actually made into a sidekick, a friend, a partner to Pinocchio.
And more he comes to dominate the picture.
Very contemporary American wisecracking character.
Hey, Blobbermouth, open up! I gotta get in there!
And it's that constant humor of Jiminy's and that constant ability to deflate a serious situation, add a little spin,
No more privacy than a goldfish.
or just a little dollop of humor at a moment that might otherwise not be funny, that makes the film work as a whole.
It could be worse. Be cheerful. Like me.
The humor in Pinocchio is just timeless.
Screwball in a corner pocket.
It's just as funny today as it would have been back then. You look at any movie from the 30s, 40s, very few hold up without being a little dated, a little corny. Pinocchio isn't.
Close your eyes. What do you see?
Nothing.
Open them. Now what do you see?
Spots.
Ha-ha!
A lot of the film has a kind of thread of irony running under it. You know, they had some pretty clever story people and some pretty clever music people working on this. So even though Honest John sings,
Hi-diddly-dee, a night is light for me.
he's doing it to hoodwink Pinocchio. And that's a sense of irony. Jiminy Cricket has a line which I love after Pinocchio is successful as an actor on the stage.
What does an actor want with a conscience anyway?
The fact of the matter is there's all sorts of these ironies going through it. Stromboli is another great example.
What's this?
He's counting all of his money. He encounters a slug. He starts to curse. He goes,
For you, my little Pinocchio.
like he's bestowing a great gift on him.
For me?
And it's contrasted with Pinocchio's innocence. All of the characters have that kind of richness to them, and the storytelling has that kind of richness to it. I mean, you already know if they're going to go someplace called Pleasure Island, that's going to be bad news.
Look at yourself. Smoking. Playing pool. No!
Pinocchio's about temptation. We all are tempted every day. Do we do the right thing or do we do the wrong thing?
Where do you suppose all the kids went to, Lampwick? No, they're around here somewhere. What do you care?
So we all can watch Pinocchio, whether you're 5 or 55 or 105, and go, I wonder what I would do in that situation. It's so hard to be good.
My nose! What's happened?
Perhaps you haven't been telling the truth, Pinocchio.
On the one hand, Pinocchio is very faithful to the original stories. On the other hand, Disney lightened it up and made it more palatable to an American audience. But it does retain those dark fairy tale origins where really bad things can happen to you if you don't follow the rules or don't have a conscience. Things can go wrong. In order to illustrate that, Disney has to show it to you in all of its horror in some cases.
Most of Walt's early films, as wonderful as they are to look at, definitely had the dark side to them. Snow White and the Queen, you know, asking for Snow White's heart to be brought to her in a box. I mean, how horrific is that?
In Pinocchio, it is heightened to this extraordinary degree because here you have a child A child who is a true innocent. He's a child and a puppet at the same time. He doesn't understand the threat that these sinister characters present to him.
Allergic?
Yes, and there is only one cure.
Pinocchio's life, existence, future is constantly under threat, constantly menaced. Menace is constantly creeping at the edges of every scene. It's an extraordinarily disturbing and emotionally moving film.
Some story things went up and I go, well, that's really unusual by modern standards. But you're willing to forgive all that because of the kind of masterwork that the whole thing is.
Years and years ago, I talked to Frank Thomas about the movie. And of course, he had a great time working on it and thinks it's a masterpiece. One of the story points that he didn't think was resolved is in the sequence where Pinocchio makes it back home to find out that his father is gone and Figaro is gone and Cleo is gone. And how will they find out where his father is? And Frank says, I remember he was still very upset about it. And then out of all things, Frank would go, the blue fairy in shape of a dove comes down, you know, and drops this note to inform Pinocchio where the father is.
I understand that there are differing opinions about how effective the story is. I think it's important to remember that the book was written episodically. It was written for publication in a periodical, so it came out in little bits and pieces and then was put together into a book.
This is a story structure which is quite unlike anything which Disney had ever done before.
The episodic thread of it allows you to give a huge amount of scope to the film just by all of these different places that Pinocchio and Jiminy have to go.
Come, the coach departs at midnight.
I think that the way it has been organized and arranged, it's a great story. For me, it serves as a springboard for an exploration of wonderful things that can be accomplished in animation.
Oh, Figaro. I forgot to open the window.
What I love about Pinocchio are the characters. I think that they really are by far the strongest cast of characters in any feature they've done because they all have such teeth to them.
You are sensational.
You mean I'm good?
I think that's one thing the film benefits from by the fact that it is episodic. You've got each of these set pieces for these marvelous, rich characters to come and interact with Pinocchio and Jiminy. And that really gives each of these animators the opportunity to make each of their characters really, really strong.
The whole thrust of what the Disney studio did in the 1930s had to do with personality animation, but that is the heart of the art. Creating these convincing personalities through the way the characters move is a lot of what the stories were all about, because the story grows out of what you can most effectively do with the characters.
When Walt Disney first started in the animation business, his films were based very largely on fantasy. They were just pencil drawings that were brought to life with very sketchy backgrounds. They were very fantastic in the sense that these characters could do anything.
If you look at the animation that preceded Pinocchio, all of them were great experiments. All of them were really amazing achievements, whether it was in the short films and the silly symphonies, or animation to music, or whether it was the push for personality animation. Everything was adding to the flavor of what was great animation. And in Pinocchio, everything clicked.
That settles it.
There's been a lot of talk in recent years about the 9 old men, who were the 9 artists who were pretty much the mainstay of the animation department for a lot of years. At the time we're talking about here, in the late 1930s, the 9 old men were still sort of the 9 young whippersnappers. And the guys who actually were the mainstays of the animation department then were people like Norm Ferguson, Fred Moore, people who had actually created the whole aesthetic of Disney animation during the 1930s.
2 of the stars on the animation staff at the studio at this time were Bill Teitla and Art Babbitt, who had really absorbed all the lessons of the 1930s at the studio, and in fact were the stars that the 9 old men looked up to.
Bill Teitla was, in the estimation of a lot of people, one of the greatest animators who ever lived. One of the things that he was really known for was his animation of really strong, powerful, forceful characters. I think he may be best known today for animating Chernobog in Night on Bald Mountain. So it's not too surprising to find him doing Stromboli.
Quiet! Shut him up! Before I knock you silly!
I just love the way Stromboli rocks the room. He just has such weight and power and comedy.
Introducing the only marionette who can sing and dance absolutely without the aids of a string. Are you up, soul, Pietra?
I don't know what causes that sound, but it is an incredible, terrifying sound that he came up with.
Actually, in the story meetings, they discussed doing new sounds, things that we hadn't heard before. I mean, specifically, we're looking for something that would get people's attention because it was something they had not experienced in an earlier film. Whether it was using unusual percussion sounds, or in the case of the Blue Fairy, this would become sort of a trademark for magic, where you have strings and celesta being sort of the keyboard high bells, but also the use of a novacord, which is a very, very early electronic piano that has a very ethereal, strange sound to it. It's the sound of magic, and films from this point on would very much look to that sound as sort of the standard.
I could listen to this whole movie without any visual at all and be completely transported to this sort of magical place and time. So it's a story in itself, just orally, to go through this film.
Pinocchio holds the distinction of being the first Disney feature to win Academy Awards for both musical categories, for Best Score and for Best Song, in this case, When You Wish Upon a Star. They would not receive those dual honors again until Mary Poppins, so this is quite some time, and then again in the late 80s, early 90s, with the Ashman and Menken features beginning with The Little Mermaid. So Pinocchio really sets a new bar for the kind of music that Disney was producing.
Originally, people thought that the musical score of Pinocchio wasn't nearly as good as Snow White, but in years hence, they realized that this is one of the greatest scores for a film that was ever made.
The main part of Pinocchio's score was written by Lee Harleen, who came to Disney in the early 1930s and scored a lot of the most musically complex of the silly symphonies, films like Music Land. And the band concert. And Grasshopper and the Ants. For Pinocchio, he really has his work cut out for him, because there are these songs that come up throughout the film, but there are far more dramatic moments in this film than anything else that Disney had done prior to this.
And if you listen to the range of styles that he uses in the film, the charming, quaint music box kind of music in the early sequences in Geppetto's workshop is one thing.
A lot of downbeats in there.
You get to Pleasure Island, and you've got honky-tonks, kind of jazzy, bluesy music going on. You've got the music at the puppet show, where the song is sung by Pinocchio.
I got no strings to hold me down, to make me fret or make me frown.
And then taken through all of these international variations by all the other puppets in the show.
You have no strings, your arms is free. I've got strings, but unto you. Bear me and I fun goes, but I'd rather go with you. Eh?
The guy could cover practically any style of music. And it's easy to underestimate just what a magnificent score that is until you listen to the music by itself.
There are no strings on me.
Paul Smith also worked on the score for Pinocchio. He came to Disney in the mid-1930s, a few years after Lee Harleen, and he scored numerous Disney shorts. He's probably best remembered as having scored the True Life Adventure series in the 1950s, these live-action animal films that had a story to them. And the third person to work extensively on the score was Ned Washington. Now, Ned Washington was a lyricist, and he wrote the lyrics to some particularly famous songs like Singin' in the Bathtub and Stella by Starlight. He would win an Academy Award not just for When You Wish Upon a Star and for the score, but he actually won another Academy Award for another song he wrote in 1952, that being the title song to High Noon, Do Not Forsake Me, Oh My Darlin'. So he really is someone who historically is very much associated with very popular songs.
Hi diddly dee, an actor's life for me. A high silk hat and a silver cane, a watch of gold with a diamond chain.
What's interesting about the score is it's not just songs. It is a through-composed piece, just extraordinarily orchestrated. And it's used ironically, and we don't expect that usually from animation films.
I hit strings, but now I'm free. There are no strings on me.
When he's singing about his freedom, I've got no strings, we are aware that he has been entrapped by people that bear him no goodwill.
They got strings, but you can see there are no strings on me.
The animated cartoons, in particular, were really the first films that really, the music and the songs not only were part of what the story was, but they actually moved the story along.
Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? Big bad wolf, big bad wolf.
We have all grown up with many, many musicals, Broadway musicals, very famous things, but the classic Broadway musical that we know, that where the story is told through music, really started in the 40s.
In the development of the movie musical, from the time the talkies came along in the late 1920s through the 1930s, the great step forward, which was often credited to the Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers movies of that time, was making the songs part of the story. No one had thought of that before. And even on Broadway, that wasn't commonplace.
But really, it didn't take off until Oklahoma of the 1940s. But Disney was making Snow White and Pinocchio and even his Silly Symphony cartoons with music and songs that moved the films along with the songs and music before that. And it's really a precursor to it.
Walt just had a way or a vision that why waste time with a song? Why not have a song advance story?
Hey, that's simple.
Now, most people know the music in Pinocchio mainly by way of When You Wish Upon a Star. That became kind of an anthem for the studio. But originally, the idea was you got Geppetto wishing that the puppet could become a real boy.
Wouldn't it be nice if he was a real boy?
And then somebody comes up with the idea of having him wish on a star, starlight, star bright, the way people have done sometimes. So the obvious thing is to have Harleen write a song about wishing on a star. That's all it was. But as we know it became one of the best-known songs in history.
Anything your heart desires will come to you.
When You Wish Upon a Star is a once-in-a-lifetime song. For Disney, it's the equivalent of Somewhere Over the Rainbow. And that kind of wishing song, that kind of dreams may come true song is so unique to Disney.
Fate steps in and sees you through.
And sung by a cricket, which I always thought was amazing. You know, you would say, well, let's give that song to the beautiful young princess or the handsome... No, it's sung by a cricket wearing a tuxedo.
I don't think anybody could ever do it better than Cliff Edwards did. There's been several top-notch vocalists that tried it. They come close, but not quite.
If your heart is in your dream, no request is too extreme.
And what the song speaks of is hope, affirmation. It speaks of a belief in dreams. And interestingly, it has gone on speaking to people in exactly the same way, so that it became the song which represented Disney. This became Disney's anthem.
Our dreams come Pinocchio, my son!
When Pinocchio was first released, there was a great deal of anticipation.
Oh, yes! Pinocchio, my boy!
The reviews, when it first opened, you see the critics just falling over themselves, trying to come up with new superlatives to convey the idea that this is an even better film than Snow White.
Oh, that's nothing.
But then an odd thing happened, and it wasn't very successful at the box office.
I'll bet a lot of you folks don't believe that.
The explanation that you usually hear is that the European market was being cut off because of the war, and that was a factor.
It cost almost twice as much as Snow White, and yet it was not the success that Snow White was.
Please, Your Honor, Miss Fairy, give him another chance. For my sake, will you?
Now, of course, we look back and realize what a major achievement the film was.
20 years before Pinocchio, you were looking at stick figures and rubber hose princesses and these little vaudevillian Mickey Mouses wandering around the screen in black and white, drawn with a quarter and 2 nickels. It was a really primitive art form, and these guys moved the art form ahead to Pinocchio. I mean, that's a big journey, and that's why we stand on their shoulders, because they were the guys that brought the art form together.
Just everybody on that crew who worked on the film gave it all they've got. There isn't a movie like it. There probably never will be a movie like it. It's just a masterpiece.
This calls for a celebration.
My kids, then my grandkids, now my great-grandkids, they're still playing it. That's four decades. Pinocchio's gonna go on forever.
They like him. He's a success.